Hey guys, tonight we slip into the lace-lined, candlelit world of Victorian matrimony. You're standing in a drafty church that smells faintly of damp stone and too much perfume. Your ribs squeeze so tight in a corset that you're half convinced breathing is now optional. The pews creak as relatives you hardly know shuffle in judgmentally, and you can practically feel their eyes counting every misplaced curl in your carefully pinned hair. You probably won't survive this, though in truth, very few brides or grooms came through a Victorian wedding day without some sort of bruise to their dignity, if not their lungs. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The bells are tolling, deep and metallic, echoing across soot-stained rooftops. You clutch a bouquet of hothouse flowers, expensive, fragile, and already wilting under the gas lamps that hiss overhead. Your gloves, white but not exactly pristine, itch against your skin, and the veil pressing against your cheeks makes you feel like you've been caught in a spider's web. This, of course, is the happiest day of your life. At least, that's what every trembling aunt and stiff-collared uncle insists. Yet, even as you march forward, lace trailing behind you, you're beginning to suspect this isn't going to feel like a fairy tale. It feels more like a business deal, written in silk and taffeta, with witnesses watching for you to trip. The Victorian wedding, for all its lace and pageantry, was rarely about two people in love. It was about families showing off, about reputations, stitched into gowns, about whether your father had the right investments to match your future husband's estates. Your dress? White, because Queen Victoria wore white in 1840 and started a fashion that stuck like soot to chimney bricks. Before her, brides wore coloured gowns, often the best dress they already owned. But once the Queen had paraded down the aisle in snowy satin, society took note. White meant purity, virtue, and, let's be honest, money. Because keeping a white gown clean in smoggy, coal-burning London was about as practical as keeping a goose in your parlour. Now picture this. You've been sewn into your gown since dawn, literally stitched into it because the tiny pearl buttons march up your spine like a military parade, and there's no undoing them without an army of maids. Your shoes pinch and your veil itches, but your job is to glide. If you trip, you'll be in the gossip columns by tea time. You hear the organ groan to life, wheezing out a hymn that rattles your skull, and suddenly everyone rises, eyes trained on you, as though you are both a saint and a sacrificial lamb. Scholars still argue whether Victorian weddings were genuinely solemn religious affairs or more akin to theatrical productions. Some historians insist the heavy emphasis on church ceremony reflected the era's obsession with morality, while others point out that by the late century, half the fuss was about fashion plates, society photographers, and how much lace could be crammed into a train. Either way, you walk down that aisle with the sense that your every move is not your own. And there's the groom, standing awkwardly at the altar in his stiff collar, his expression halfway between boredom and terror. He has likely had less say in this day than you might imagine. His family arranged, his pocketbook displayed, his role scripted. He waits, gloves clutched behind his back, knowing full well that once he says, "I do," he gains not just a wife, but control over her property, her income, and legally, even her body. You, meanwhile, gain the privilege of being respectable, at least until you fail to produce a son. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Right now, you are still trapped in the pomp of the ceremony, where every detail is another layer of suffocation. The ring slips onto your finger, a plain gold band, because anything fancier would have been considered vulgar. The vicar drones on, words about love and duty floating up into the rafters where soot-blackened angels stare down unimpressed. And you? You're mostly trying not to faint from the combined effects of nerves, hunger, and the fact that your corset feels like it's been engineered by someone who hated ribs. Here's the quirky part. Many brides carried sprigs of herbs, or orange blossoms tucked into their bouquets, not just for beauty, but to mask the less romantic smells of Victorian crowds. Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder with relatives who haven't bathed properly in weeks, the church air thick with damp wool and pipe smoke. A little lavender suddenly feels like salvation. When the vows finally end and the kiss is placed, dutifully, if awkwardly, on your cheek, you stumble back down the aisle, veil fluttering like a flag of surrender. Outside, the crowd throws rice, or, if they're poor and can't afford rice, they fling oats or flower petals, or simply cheer with the kind of shrill enthusiasm that makes you wish for earplugs. Photographers wait, cameras on tripods, ready to freeze your strained smile forever in sepia. Remember, blink, and you'll look like a sleep-deprived ghost for the next century's family album. The carriage ride to the reception is no relief. You sit with your new husband, both of you pressed against cushions that smell faintly of mildew, neither speaking much. He fiddles with his gloves. You stare at the window fogged with condensation. The horse clops through puddled streets, and, outside, soot drifts down like confetti, sticking to the hem of your gown. You tell yourself this is romance. You don't quite believe it. At the reception, the tables groan under the weight of roast beef, jellied eels, and endless puddings. Guests dig in, not caring that your corset prevents you from swallowing more than 2 polite bites. The cake is the centerpiece. A towering, fruit-laden beast, iced so thickly that slicing it requires both a sword and determination. Tradition dictates that you keep the top tier to eat on your first anniversary, or, more optimistically, at your first child's christening. Never mind that the thing is so dense it could be used as a building brick. You smile through it all, nodding at endless relatives, listening to your new husband's friends slap his back and make jokes about the ball and chain. Somewhere, in the background, a string quartet squeaks through a waltz and couples spin across the floor in dizzy circles. You'd like to join, but the gown won't allow for more than a cautious shuffle, and your shoes feel like medieval torture devices. As the evening drags on, the nerves don't fade. They settle into your bones like dampness. You realize that this wedding isn't just one exhausting day. It's the doorway into a life you didn't fully choose, bound by laws, expectations, and lace so stiff it could stand on its own. Tomorrow, you'll wake up as a wife, and the real complications will begin. But tonight, under chandeliers that sputter gaslight and drip wax onto the tablecloths, you sit in your gown, smiling until your cheeks ache, playing your part in the great Victorian performance of marriage, and through it all, the nerves never quite leave. They follow you into the carriage, into the hotel, into the hush of the bridal chamber, where a strange mix of expectation and dread waits in the shadows. Your wedding day is over, but the uneasy truth has only just begun to settle in. In Victorian England, marriage is less about love and more about survival, and you are now a player in a drama you cannot walk out of. The day after the wedding dawns grey and heavy, the streets slick with drizzle, the kind of English weather that seeps into your bones and makes the air taste faintly of soot. You open your eyes in a strange room, a rented bridal suite that smells of coal smoke and rosewater, and before you can even adjust to this new reality, you feel it. The subtle weight of parental hands guiding your future, the sense that you are less a newlywed than a pawn carefully moved across a family's chessboard. You might have thought marriage was a private decision, but in Victorian England, it was rarely yours to make. Your parents' influence lingers, like an echo in every choice that led to yesterday's vows. From the moment you reached marriageable age, they treated you like a piece in a grand bargain. Love was, at best, a polite afterthought. Something considered charming, but not strictly necessary. What truly mattered was lineage, money, reputation, the invisible scaffolding that kept families upright in the rigid hierarchy of the time. You sit at breakfast, staring down a plate of eggs, gone rubbery from the coal stove, your new husband opposite you with the paper rustling between his fingers, and you realize how little of this match was about what either of you wanted. For weeks, your parents orchestrated every detail, with conversations spoken in half whispers behind closed doors. They spoke of settlements and prospects, of who might bring property into the family, of how much influence a title might hold. They spoke of you, but not to you. It's not that parental involvement in marriage was unusual, far from it. The Victorian family was deeply hierarchical, the father at its head like a stern general, the mother enforcing social codes with the precision of a sergeant major. You were expected to obey, not to question. A daughter's duty was clear. Marry. Well, marry advantageously and bring no shame upon the family name. In an era where respectability was more valuable than gold, one poor choice of husband could unravel everything. And here is a curious truth. Sometimes even siblings were part of this bargaining. If an elder daughter failed to secure a match, parents might push a younger one forward, reshuffling the deck like gamblers unwilling to leave the table. Families with too many daughters to marry off were in constant quiet panic, their dinner conversations edged with the silent calculation of who might be pushed onto which eligible bachelor next. Historians still debate whether young women were truly powerless in this process, or if some learned to maneuver within the system. Some point to diaries that show daughters gently influencing their parents' choices, steering conversations toward the suitor they preferred. Others argue that such exceptions were rare and that most girls were, in essence, traded with the cold formality of contracts. Either way, the sense of being steered remains palpable, the invisible hand on your shoulder, reminding you that your life is not entirely yours. And of course, there's the uncomfortable matter of parental negotiations, conducted almost like trade deals. Fathers met with other fathers, not in candlelit parlors of romance, but in drawing rooms where brandy was poured and ledgers kept close at hand. Marriage contracts were drawn up in legalese, stipulating what property came with the bride, what money would flow, and what expectations of inheritance might follow. If you felt like a commodity, it was because you were treated as one, valued, priced, exchanged. The breakfast grows colder as you think back on the endless parade of suitors you were marched before. Some dinners were stiff and formal, with introductions that felt like job interviews. One man boasted about his railway shares as if reciting love poetry. Another inspected your hands as though checking a horse's teeth. Your mother's eyes, watched from the corner of the room, sharp as pins, measuring every smile, every nod. Did you laugh too loudly? Did you fail to seem impressed? These tiny missteps were noted and whispered about later. Occasionally, love did appear, flickering like a candle in the wind. Perhaps you recall a neighbor's son who made you laugh with foolish jokes, or a clerk who wrote you notes that smelled of ink and possibility. But when you hinted at affection, your parents scoffed. Love is a luxury, they reminded you, not a foundation. They spoke as though marriage were a ship to be built of sturdy oak and iron nails, not fragile things like affection. Yet you could not help but wonder, what is the point of a vessel that floats but never sails? The odd thing, though, is that some parents did value affection, at least in theory. Manuals of the times stressed compatibility, urging families to consider whether couples might suit one another in temperament as well as fortune. It was advice often ignored, but it lingered, an echo of romantic ideals hovering over the reality of pragmatic deals. And so you sit there, sipping weak tea, wondering whether your parents believed in happiness at all, or whether happiness was just a rumor they dismissed in favor of solid investments. Let's pause for a moment on one of the quirks of the age. Advertisements in newspapers sometimes read like classified ads for marriages, thinly veiled descriptions of eligible men and women that spoke of fortunes, estates, and respectable connections. Imagine flipping through the pages and finding yourself listed there, reduced to a paragraph describing your dowry and your pleasing disposition. It would be funny if it weren't so bleak. Your mind drifts back to the day the match was decided. Perhaps you remember the hushed conversation in the drawing room, the way your father cleared his throat before announcing that Mr. So-and-so has made an offer. An offer, as though you were a parcel to be delivered, a commodity to be bid upon. Your mother's hand tightened on your shoulder, gentle but unyielding, and you knew that protest was futile. To refuse was to risk scandal, to risk the family's standing. And so you smiled, or tried to, though your lips trembled with the effort. scholars still wrestle with the question of how much agency daughters truly had. Did they whisper their preferences, nudging their parents toward one suitor over another? Did they ever outright refuse? And if so, what were the consequences? Letters survive that suggest some courage. Girls who pleaded or cajoled, who won or lost their battles behind the heavy curtains of Victorian parlours. But just as many stories vanish into silence, leaving us only with the stiff smiles of wedding portraits, the truth hidden beneath lace veils and polite expressions. As you finish your tea, you feel the weight of those choices, or rather, the lack of them, settle like the drizzle outside. Your marriage is not just a union of two people, but a binding of two families, two fortunes, two sets of expectations that were crafted long before you ever whispered, "I do." And so the parental shadow lingers, long after the vows, shaping your every step. You rise from the table, your new husband folding his paper, and the silence between you feels less like peace and more like the echo of negotiations that neither of you truly commanded. Outside, the rain continues, pattering against the glass, a rhythm that seems to whisper the truth you already know. In Victorian England, marriage was rarely yours to choose. It was chosen for you, written in the ledger books and spoken in the hushed tones of parents who believed they knew better. And so you step into your new life, not entirely sure whether you've been given a gift or a sentence, carrying with you the unshakable knowledge that even in the privacy of your own home, your parents' hands are still guiding you from afar. The house is quiet when you return from the honeymoon, but the silence feels less like peace and more like a ledger settling into place. You've been deposited into a marriage where numbers matter more than kisses, and where dowries and inheritances hover like ghosts in every room. The ink of the contracts that sealed your future may have dried, but you can still feel it pressing down on you, invisible yet undeniable, like an extra layer of clothing you can never take off. Marriage in Victorian England was not simply about companionship, it was about money, and every family knew it. You were a dowry before you were a daughter, an inheritance before you were a bride. Your worth had been tallied in ledgers long before you could spell your own name. That neat column of figures determined who might call at your door, who might slip a card into your parents' silver tray, who might, eventually, be declared the right match. The ritual of dowries is something you cannot escape. Fathers scrape together fortunes, sometimes selling land or mortgaging property, to provide enough to tempt a suitor. Mothers, meanwhile, oversaw the trousseau, the linens, the silver, the clothes that would demonstrate just how respectable and prosperous their daughter was. These were not gifts so much as investments, carefully calculated signals of status. And here you are, married at last, your dowry now woven into your husband's accounts, absorbed like water into dry earth. Sitting at the breakfast table, you realize the unspoken truth. Your dowry was not only a ticket into marriage, but also a guarantee against your own independence. For once the money was handed over, it no longer belonged to you. It passed into your husband's control as thoroughly as if you had dropped it into his pocket yourself. You sip weak tea and think of the irony that money meant to protect you has instead made you more vulnerable, leaving you without the cushion you once imagined might be yours. There's a strange little detail whispered about in some households. If a bride's family was particularly ambitious, they might offer sweeteners beyond money, like a fine carriage, a collection of rare books, or even parcels of exotic tea imported from the far reaches of empire. These eccentric additions to a dowry became fodder for gossip. Neighbours chuckling about the bride who brought her husband a coach and six before she brought him a child. You cannot help but smirk at the absurdity, even as you feel the weight of your own invisible price tag. Historians still argue about how rigidly these dowry systems shaped every marriage. Some insist that love could sometimes soften the edges, pointing to couples who grew genuinely close despite the financial scaffolding that surrounded their union. Others argue that money was the foundation, and without it, affection was powerless to override the hard logic of inheritance and property. Whatever the case, You feel caught in a system that has already decided your value and cashed it in. The pressure of inheritance sits just as heavily. If you are the daughter of a wealthy man, you may find yourself the centerpiece of whispered conversations about who stands to gain access to those future riches. If your family is less fortunate, you may be pushed toward a match that will secure not love, not happiness, but financial survival. It is a strange experience, realizing that your womb is considered part of an economic strategy, your future children spoken of as though they are entries in an account book not yet written. Even among the wealthiest families, disputes festered, brothers quarreled over settlements, uncles contested wills, cousins eyed inheritances with suspicion. You, meanwhile, sat at the center of it all, dressed in lace, smiling politely, the very embodiment of the transaction. The ink may have been signed by men, but the cost is carried in your veins, in your daily reality, in the hush that surrounds you every time the subject of money surfaces at dinner. And yet, there are moments of comedy in the bleakness. You hear stories of grooms shocked to discover that the promised dowry was smaller than rumored, of fathers inflating their daughters' prospects as though they were selling a horse at market. One story circulates about a young man who agreed to a marriage, believing he'd receive a tidy estate in Surrey, only to find out it was nothing more than a leaking farmhouse and a few stubborn goats. In that moment, you almost pity him. Almost. But pity doesn't erase the truth. Your dowry, your inheritance, these financial threads bind you more tightly than your corset. They define the contours of your marriage long before affection or trust can shape it. And as you fold your napkin, glance at the husband across from you with his newspaper and his distracted frown, you realize that the real wedding wasn't the one with lace and vows. The real wedding was the ledger, the contracts, the quiet calculations of parents long before you ever entered that church. Outside, the rain taps against the glass, and you feel it again. The sense that this union is not built on love, but on numbers, that your life is less your own than it ever was. In Victorian England, marriage is an account settled, a balance sheet completed, and you are the entry inked in the middle, unerasable and unowned. The ink on the marriage contract has barely dried, but you can already feel the iron bars of Victorian gender rules closing around you. The shift is subtle at first. Small gestures, words spoken with the casual authority of someone who knows the law is on his side. Your husband folds his newspaper and declares he will handle the finances from now on. You nod because what else can you do? You know that once you said "I do," your property, your earnings, even the money you brought with you as a dowry are no longer yours. They belong to him, absorbed into his identity as naturally as your name, which you now carry like a borrowed cloak. It's an odd kind of invisibility, one you begin to notice in every corner of your new life. In law, you do not quite exist as yourself anymore. You are absorbed into your husband, legally fused into his being under a principle the Victorians inherited from earlier centuries. If he signs a contract, it binds you too. If he runs into debt, you may share the shame of it, though not the power to undo it. If he strikes it rich, the wealth is his alone. You exist within him, like a shadow stitched onto his figure. As you walk through the neighborhood, you notice how even polite greetings reinforce this reality. Neighbors no longer address you by your own name. You are Mrs. So-and-so, your individuality absorbed into a title that carries his surname. The first time you hear it, the sound feels strange, like a costume that doesn't quite fit. You smile anyway, because smiling is expected, and because the alternative, revealing how much you miss the sound of your own name, feels like a secret you're not supposed to share. Scholars still argue about how deeply women resisted or accepted this erasure. Some letters and diaries reveal quiet acts of rebellion. Wives who kept hidden savings in jars, who wrote under pen names, who created small islands of independence in a sea of control. Others suggest that many accepted their fate, internalizing the idea that obedience and silence were their virtues. But even if acceptance softened the edges, the legal structure remained. You were not recognized as separate, but as an extension of your husband's will. There are moments when this erasure turns absurd. Imagine, for instance, a woman who runs a small shop or takes in sewing. The income she earns by law belongs to her husband, even if he has never touched a needle or spoken to a single customer. There are tales of wives dutifully handing over their small earnings, only to watch husbands spend them at taverns, the fruits of their labor disappearing in clouds of ale and smoke. And still, the law calls this justice. Yet in the middle of this suffocating reality, a peculiar practice emerges. Some women begin to sign letters or documents with their husband's name, but they add a delicate flourish, a loop of ink at the end, as if to whisper, "I am still here," hidden in the margin. It's a small, almost invisible rebellion, but it lingers like perfume in a room after the lady has left. You imagine your own hand tracing such a flourish, not enough to change the law, but enough to remind yourself that you exist. The dining table at night is a theatre of these gender rules. Your husband speaks of politics, investments, or business dealings, while you are expected to nod and keep the conversation light. Should you venture an opinion too boldly, you risk a frown or a silencing laugh, the reminder that your role is not to lead, but to support. It is not that your intelligence is doubted exactly. It is that your intelligence is inconvenient, something to be brushed aside in favor of harmony. And yet, you hear whispers from other households. A wife who manages the estate books better than her husband, her figures precise, her predictions sharper than his. Another who handles correspondence, shaping business deals through her letters while her husband signs them. These quiet stories hint at realities that exist alongside the official narrative, contradictions that historians puzzle over. Did Victorian women truly lack power, or did they wield it indirectly, cloaked in obedience, but sharp in practice? The debate lingers, unresolved, a shadow cast by every diary and ledger uncovered. Even in the bedroom, the rules follow you. Your body, once your own, is now bound by law to your husband's rights. Refusal is not an option acknowledged in polite society. You lie awake some nights, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of that truth pressing down on your chest, heavier than the quilt. And still, in the morning, you rise, tie your hair back, and smile for the neighbors, the picture of a dutiful wife. Walking through the market, you notice how men's voices fill the air, loud and unashamed, while women hover at the edges, clutching baskets, their voices lowered, their presence half erased. It's not that women are absent, they are everywhere, buying, bargaining, managing households, but they are framed as background, while men stand at the center. You begin to realize that Victorian society is a stage, and the script leaves you few lines of your own. At home, the gender rules are stitched into daily rituals. You pour tea while your husband sits. You manage the servants, but always under his authority. You sew, you mend, you smile, and through it all, the sense grows stronger. You are no longer the subject of your own life, but a character written into someone else's story. The quirk of it is that sometimes men themselves complain of the weight of these rules. There are husbands who feel trapped by expectations of control, who stumble under the pressure of being the sole authority. Some even envy the emotional closeness their wives share with one another, the networks of letters and visits that men often lack. But rarely do they name this envy aloud. They simply drink another glass of port, sigh heavily, and continue to play their assigned roles. As you lay your head on the pillow, the day folding into silence, you cannot help but feel the duality of it all. You exist, and yet you don't. You are seen, and yet not as yourself. Victorian marriage has given you a title, a role, a set of expectations as rigid as iron. But somewhere beneath it, the faint thread of your own self still lingers, waiting, whispering, hoping not to be lost entirely in the shadows of gender rules too heavy to lift. The vows have been spoken, the ink of contracts dried, and yet when you lie awake at night in the dim flicker of a guttering candle, you begin to feel a deeper truth. Your consent was more performance than power. In Victorian England, to say yes did not always mean you were choosing freely. Sometimes, it meant only that you had learned how to smile and nod while the walls closed in around you. Picture yourself at the altar again, the vicar's words rolling like a tide you cannot resist. You repeat them because that is what is expected, because the silence of refusal would shake the room like a thunderclap. Did you want this match? Perhaps, or perhaps not. But once the machinery of family and society had been set in motion, your own wishes became no more than threads tangled in a much larger web. You might whisper them to yourself at night, but daylight would sweep them away like soot on the wind. This illusion of choice is stitched into every aspect of marriage. A girl might be asked her opinion on a suitor, but the question is often posed in such a way that refusal would seem petulant, ungrateful, even dangerous. Imagine a father standing stiffly by the fire, eyebrows raised, reminding you of the sacrifices made, the dowry arranged, the expectations set. Imagine a mother's quiet hand squeezing yours, whispering about duty, reputation, the shame that could fall on all of you if you dared to say no. In that moment, what does yes really mean? And yet, society paraded the idea of consent like a polished trophy. The law declared that marriages must be entered into freely. The churches demanded vows spoken aloud, proof that both bride and groom agreed. But agreement spoken under pressure, with the weight of family honor pressing into your shoulders, was no freedom at all. It was a script, carefully memorized, dutifully delivered, applauded by all in attendance who knew the lines as well as you did. There are stories that flit through society like half-whispered ghosts. Young women who wept through their ceremonies, brides who fainted during the vows, grooms who walked stiffly, their jaws clenched as though sealing their own coffin. And still, the ceremony went on. The I do was pronounced, the rings exchanged, the contracts filed, the marriage declared holy and binding. Your voice may have trembled, but once spoken, it was taken as truth. Historians still debate how much space women really had to resist. Were there moments when families relented, when a girl's tears or stubborn silence shifted the course of a match? Some letters suggest yes, that now and then a suitor was turned away, because the bride-to-be could not stomach the thought. Others argue this was rare, that more often tears dried and protests faded, smoothed over by the pressure of respectability. The truth, perhaps, is somewhere in between, lingering like the fog on London streets. Thick, shifting, impossible to pin down. You recall an unsettling quirk that reveals much about the hollowness of consent. There were cases of child marriages. Girls barely into their teens led to the altar with solemn vows on lips that still stumbled over their lessons. Technically, they had agreed. They had spoken the words. But what choice does a girl of 13 truly have? What power does she wield when everyone around her insists she is doing what is best? These marriages, though legal, cast long shadows, their echoes found in the sad diaries of women who grew old before they ever grew up. The dinner table in your new home offers another reminder. You sit opposite your husband, nodding politely, as he discusses matters you scarcely care about. Did you consent to this life? You said yes, certainly. But you said yes in a world where saying no was more perilous than bending to the inevitable. Even in small things, the illusion persists. When you serve the roast, when you smile at neighbors, when you walk arm in arm through the park, people see agreement. They never see the silence that came before it, the unspoken truth that sometimes consent is only the absence of open rebellion. You find yourself wondering, late at night, if anyone else feels the same way. You think of the neighbor down the lane, her eyes tired, her smile brittle. You wonder if she too once stood in a church and spoke words that felt hollow even as they left her lips. You wonder how many women lie awake in similar beds, their yes echoing in their ears like a bell they cannot unring. And yet, life continues. The sun rises, the kettle whistles, the neighbors gossip. Everyone agrees you are married, that you chose this, that you are content. The performance is convincing, so convincing that even you sometimes almost believe it. Almost. But when the house grows quiet, and the only sound is the ticking of the clock, you feel the truth settle into you like damp air in the bones. In Victorian England, your consent was less a choice than a script, spoken under duress, applauded by all, binding you forever in a role you never had the chance to decline. The idea of marriage as a binding promise might sound romantic from a distance, but once you are inside the Victorian household, you discover it is less like a ribbon tying two hearts together and more like iron chains rattling around your ankles. The word divorce hovers in society like a forbidden spell, whispered but rarely invoked, and always with scandal trailing in its wake. You may find yourself sitting by the fire late at night, staring into the embers, wondering what would happen if you could simply leave. But in Victorian England, leaving was almost unthinkable. To grasp the weight of it, you have to imagine the law as it was written in that era. Until the late 1850s, if you wished to dissolve your marriage, you had to go before Parliament itself. Imagine your private quarrels, your most intimate grievances, paraded like a stage play in front of men in wigs, while newspapers salivated over every detail. Only the wealthiest could afford such humiliation, and even then, they were torn apart, in public opinion. For ordinary couples, divorce was as distant as the moon, visible perhaps, but utterly unreachable. So what happened when marriages crumbled? Most simply endured. You clenched your jaw, swallowed your frustrations, and carried on. Respectability demanded it, and society was far less forgiving of failure than of misery. A wife might endure cruelty, infidelity, neglect, and still be told she must honor her vows, for better or worse, until death parted the two of you. The irony of death as the only true release from such vows was not lost on those who lived it. The imbalance of the law only sharpened the cruelty. A husband could divorce his wife for adultery alone, while a wife had to prove not just infidelity, but aggravating circumstances such as cruelty or desertion. Even then, the odds stacked heavily against her. The courtroom was not a place of sympathy for women. It was a theatre of suspicion, where her character was dissected, her every letter scrutinized, her reputation dragged through the mud until nothing remained. And the newspapers adored divorce cases. They printed the transcripts, word for word, down to the most embarrassing details, selling scandal to a hungry audience. Imagine waking to find your private sorrows splashed across the broadsheets, neighbors whispering over their morning tea about your quarrels, your shame. In some cases, people crowded into courtrooms to watch the drama unfold, treating the misery of marriage as free entertainment. Yet, in this bleakness, you stumble across an odd detail. Some women, unable to escape through the courts, found subtler ways to break free. There were stories of wives deliberately getting themselves locked into asylums, grim, terrifying places, but still a kind of escape from violent or unbearable marriages. A tragic loophole, if you can even call it that, yet one that underscores how desperate the situation could become. Scholars still debate whether Victorian society truly believed marriage to be sacred, or whether the resistance to divorce was more about preserving property and inheritance. Some argue that the insistence on permanence was rooted in religious morality, the belief that vows before God could not be broken by human whim. Others point out that behind all the sermons was a practical fear. If marriages dissolved too easily, the careful web of dowries, estates, and family alliances might unravel. Whichever the motive, the result was the same. Men and women shackled together, whether they loved, hated, or barely tolerated one another. You think of your own position as you fold away the embroidery in your lap. What if one day you could not endure? What if his temper grew violent, his indifference unbearable, his debts overwhelming? Would you have any escape? The truth hangs heavy in the room. You would not. You would endure, as countless others endured, because the law said so, because society said so, because the whisper of scandal could cut deeper than the sharpest blade. And yet, the whispers of reform begin to stir. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 created a new civil court for divorce, theoretically making it more accessible. But even then, it was costly, humiliating, and heavily biased toward men. For you, seated in your parlor with the coal smoke clinging to your dress, the law remains a wall too high to scale. So you pour another cup of tea, swallow the bitterness, and smile politely when neighbors ask after your husband. They see only the surface, the respectable facade of your marriage. They do not see the cage, gilded perhaps, but still a cage. And in Victorian England, once you stepped inside, the door was rarely opened again. The idea of love sits in your mind like a fragile glass ornament, beautiful in theory but in practice, always threatening to shatter. In Victorian England, marriage was rarely built upon it. Duty outweighed desire, reputation outweighed affection. And so the daily life of courtship became a theatre where gestures of devotion were often rehearsed more than they were felt. Imagine yourself sitting in a parlour, the heavy curtains drawn against the London soot, your mother stationed nearby with her needlework, pretending to be absorbed while her ears miss nothing. Across from you, a suitor perches uncomfortably on a chair polished to a blinding shine, balancing a teacup as though it might explode. He asks about your health, your fondness for music, your opinion on the weather, safe topics, endlessly repeated. What you wish to ask, whether he dreams of poetry, whether he laughs freely, whether he is kind, never quite makes it past your lips. Courtship rituals were designed to be performances, carefully chaperoned, bounded by rules that turned human warmth into something stilted. You might walk together in the park, but only with a maid trailing 2 steps behind. You might exchange letters, but every line is weighed, measured, dissected by family members who peer over your shoulder. The chance for genuine intimacy is as rare as clear skies in November, and so what passes for love is often duty dressed in lace. The engagement ring sparkles on your finger, not because it represents romance, but because it signifies a contract, completed. Diamonds were not yet the universal choice. Many rings bore coloured stones, each with symbolic meaning. A ruby for passion, a sapphire for fidelity, an emerald for hope. Occasionally, a groom with more eccentric taste might present a ring shaped like clasped hands, the tiny golden fingers entwined in perpetual promise. Charming, yes, but more symbolic than heartfelt. Historians still debate how much genuine affection grew in these marriages after the vows. Some argue that couples, bound together by duty, often learn to love each other in time, affection blossoming like ivy across the cold stone of practicality. Others contend that the structure of courtship made true love nearly impossible, that what emerged was companionship at best, resignation at worst. The letters and diaries left behind show both sides, some wives writing tenderly of husbands who became beloved, others penning lines of loneliness that echo through the centuries. Yet, amid this stiff choreography, quirks abound. One of the more curious rituals was the exchange of hair. Lovers would gift each other locks, carefully braided or tucked into lockets, to be worn close to the heart. Imagine opening a locket only to find a coil of hair pressed inside like a relic. It is both tender and faintly unsettling, the Victorian way of keeping a piece of someone with you at all times. You cannot help but smile at the strangeness of it, even as you wonder whether it felt romantic or simply obligatory. The evening socials that fill your weeks only deepen the sense of performance. Dances held in glittering halls, the air heavy, with candle smoke and perfume, couples waltzing beneath chandeliers as though rehearsing roles in a grand play. You might dance with a man twice your age, chosen by your parents, while a younger one who stirs your heart is forced to watch from across the room. The music swells, the skirts whirl, but behind every step lies calculation. Who is eligible? Who is respectable? Who is profitable? And still, you play your part. You smile, you curtsy, you exchange pleasantries that feel like scripts memorized long ago. You remind yourself that this is duty, that love is a luxury you cannot afford. Yet late at night, when the candles burn low and the house falls silent, you let yourself dream. You imagine a life where affection mattered more than inheritance, where laughter mattered more than ledgers, where your heart was allowed to choose. And though you know you will wake to another day of performance, you cling to that dream like a secret talisman, hidden in the folds of your pillow. In Victorian England, love and duty were rarely equals. Duty wore the crown, love trailed behind in silence, and you, caught between the two, learned to live with a heart that longed for something the world never promised to give. The door closes with a quiet click, and suddenly the house feels too large, too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your skin. Tonight is your wedding night, and though the parlor downstairs still smells of roast beef and spilled sherry, you are now led upstairs to a bedroom thick with expectation. The candles burn low, their flames stuttering in the draught, and the air is heavy with perfume sprinkled on the sheets as though scent alone could smooth away dread. Victorian modesty casts a long shadow over this room. You've spent years being told as little as possible about what to expect, your education carefully, trimmed to preserve innocence. No one spoke frankly, they hinted, they whispered, they scolded you for curiosity. What you know comes more from overheard gossip than any real preparation. You stand in front of the mirror, unlacing your gown with fumbling fingers, your reflection a blur of silk and uncertainty. This is where the veil of romance thins, where the carefully staged performance of courtship gives way to awkward reality. For men, the night is framed as a triumph, a victory to be won. For women, it is a surrender, wrapped in lace and silence. You know that tomorrow, people will look at you differently, as though something irreversible has happened, though nothing visible will have changed. The law and society alike grant your husband rights tonight that you cannot contest. The idea of refusal does not exist in this room, not in any official sense. Consent has been signed away with your vows, replaced by duty. You lie down on the embroidered coverlet, staring at the ceiling beams, the air thick with both expectation and fear. The creak of the mattress beneath you feels louder than church bells. And yet, amid this tension, you recall something curious. Many couples, especially in middle-class households, left the bedsheets stained deliberately with red wine or animal blood, proof to be displayed the next day as evidence of consummation. Servants might be asked to carry the sheets into view, an absurd ritual of public validation for what should have been private. You shudder at the thought, imagining your most vulnerable moment transformed into a spectacle of linen. Historians still argue about how much knowledge brides truly possessed. Before the wedding night, some suggest girls were kept in deliberate ignorance, shielded to preserve their supposed innocence, which only increased the fear and confusion when the moment arrived. Others argue that whispered conversations among sisters and friends filled, in more blanks than we assume, that women entered the chamber nervous, but not entirely naive. Whichever the truth, the uncertainty hung over every bride like a shroud, making the night less about intimacy than about endurance. Your husband shifts, beside you, awkward, perhaps just as uncertain as you are. He has been raised with the idea that his authority extends into this room as naturally as into the drawing room or dining hall. Yet even he may feel the strain of expectation, the sense that this moment is a test not only of love, but of masculinity, respectability, even lineage. The bed is less a place of rest than a stage where roles must be performed, whether either of you knows the script or not. Later, when the candle gutters out and the room sinks into shadow, you lie awake listening to the sound of his breathing. You wonder if affection will grow here, in this strange new intimacy, or whether the marriage bed will remain another place where duty trumps desire. You think of women you know who whisper of tenderness, of laughter shared beneath the sheets. But you also think of those who carry only silence and sorrow into their mornings. Tomorrow, the household will treat you differently. Servants will glance at you knowingly. Neighbors will look for signs of a shift in your expression. You are now a wife in full, expected to bear children, to build a family, to embody virtue and respectability. The weight of it presses down on you as the night lengthens, as though the air itself has thickened. You pull the coverlet tighter, around your shoulders, your body tense, your mind restless. This is the reality of the Victorian wedding night. A collision of modesty, misinformation, and heavy silence. It is not the stuff of romantic novels, not a tender unfolding of passion, but a ceremony within a ceremony, one that leaves you lying, awake long after the house has fallen quiet, wondering if this is truly what forever is meant to feel like. Morning light slants through the curtains, dull and grey, and the glow does nothing to soften the truth of your new life. The wedding has passed. The reception is a memory. The whispered nerves of the bridal chamber a thing of the night before. Now comes the reality of daily married life, and it settles around you with the heaviness of a coal fog. You stir awake in a room that no longer feels like yours. The bed, with its heavy carved posts and sagging mattress, creaks as you rise. A draft snakes in through the window frame, carrying the smell of damp soot from the street below. Beside you, your husband is already up, buttoning his waistcoat, his movements practiced, automatic, as though he has lived this routine forever, and you are simply being folded into it. The day begins with expectation, not choice. Breakfast is not a meal, but a duty. You sit opposite him at the long table, tea cooling in china cups, bacon curling on a platter, conversation reduced to clipped exchanges about errands and schedules. You smile politely, because silence feels colder than the drizzle outside. Already, you sense the rhythm of your days has been written for you. Meals, chores, visits, evenings by the fire. A script without improvisation. Victorian homes were built on strict rituals, and within them, women carried the endless burden of order. You are expected to oversee the servants, if you are fortunate enough to have them, or shoulder the work yourself if you are not. Either way, the responsibility is yours, managing meals, laundry, mending, and the ceaseless cycle of cleaning coal dust that creeps into every corner. Respectability demands spotless rooms, crisp linens, polished silver, even when your hands ache and your patience frays. The irony is sharp. Society imagines you as an ornament, a lady of grace and leisure. But behind the doors of your home, you are less an ornament than the invisible machinery that keeps the household alive. You patch stockings, you balance accounts for bread and coal. You ensure that your husband never sees the sweat behind the shine. To falter would mean whispers, neighbors noting that she cannot keep a house, a stain on your reputation that lingers longer than soot on lace. There is one curious detail about this daily life that makes you smile despite yourself. Some households kept hedgehogs in the kitchen, not as pets exactly, but as insect hunters, scurrying about at night to devour cockroaches and beetles. Imagine, in your elegant home, beneath the polished table and embroidered cloth, a spiny creature rustling about, more efficient than any servant. It's a small reminder that behind the polished veneer of Victorian life, strangeness and practicality often walked hand in hand. Historians still wrestle with the question of how oppressive this daily rhythm truly felt to women. Some argue that managing a household gave wives real authority, a realm where they exercised skill and power. Others point to the monotony, the endless repetition, the lack of acknowledgement, and argue that it was more prison than domain. The truth is probably both. A realm of responsibility, but one without recognition, where labor was constant yet invisible. As you move through the day, the weight of etiquette presses down. You must remember how to sit, how to smile, how to speak in company. Too much laughter is unseemly. Too much silence is cold. Too much opinion is dangerous. You feel yourself shrinking into the margins, performing womanhood as carefully as you once rehearsed music scales. And then evening comes, and you sit by, the fire, embroidery in hand. The silence between you and your husband as thick as the coal smoke outside. He reads his paper, the rustle of pages filling the room, while you stitch small flowers onto fabric you barely see. You wonder if this is all there is. Endless chores, stiff manners, small talk stretched thin across the days. You glance at him, at his furrowed brow lit by the glow of the fire, and wonder if he feels the same. Perhaps he does, but neither of you will say it. Respectability demands quiet endurance, so you fold your embroidery, douse the lamp, and climb the stairs to bed. Tomorrow will come again, and with it the same cycle. Victorian marriage, you realize, is not just about vows or contracts or law. It is about the slow grind of days, the suppression of frustration, the endless performance of normalcy. And lying in the dark, you wonder how many years can pass before the weight of it dulls even the sharpest edges of yourself. The rhythm of your days has settled into something predictable: polished silver, creaking floorboards, dinners swallowed in silence. But now a new expectation begins to press against you, heavier than coal fog in November. It is not enough simply to keep a household. Now you must bear children, and not just one or two. In Victorian England, motherhood was both a duty and a measure of worth, and the pressure to produce heirs hung over every wife like a sword. From the moment your wedding ring slid onto your finger, people began to watch you differently. Aunts leaned in at gatherings, whispering about when the first baby might arrive. Neighbors glanced knowingly at your waistline as if they could divine the future in the fall of your gown. Respectability demanded that you move swiftly from bride to mother, transforming your body into a vessel for continuity, your womb into a ledger of legitimacy. And yet, the reality of childbearing was harsh, perilous, and unrelenting. Victorian, women often bore a dozen children or more, pregnancies following one after another with little pause. There were no antibiotics, no reliable anesthesia, no modern medicine to soften the danger. Each birth was a gamble, a crossing between life and death. You might survive, or you might not. And if you did, you faced the grinding exhaustion of nursing, rocking, soothing, only to find yourself pregnant again before the cradle was emptied. The pressure was not merely personal, it was public, institutional. The church reinforced the belief that a woman's highest duty was to bear children. Family lines depended on heirs. Inheritance required sons. The health of the empire itself, people insisted, rested on the shoulders of mothers who filled nurseries with future clerks, soldiers, and colonists. You may have longed for love, for freedom, for a chance to carve out your own identity, but society measured you by the children you bore. There is a strange and haunting detail about this era. Some women wrote in their diaries of using powdered opium, laudanum, not only for their own exhaustion, but to quiet crying infants, to buy themselves an hour of rest. Bottles of the bitter liquid were kept in cupboards, sold freely by chemists, prescribed almost casually. Imagine rocking a child whose tiny lips are stained with medicine meant as much for your sanity as for their relief. The lullabies of Victorian. Nurseries were sung in voices thick with both tenderness and desperation. Scholars still debate whether the relentless push toward motherhood was universally accepted by women, or if resistance simmered beneath the surface. Some point to reformers and writers who began to question the dangers of endless childbirth, who pleaded for more awareness, more care. Others argue that most women internalized the role, believing sincerely that motherhood was both burden and blessing, the natural path ordained by God and tradition. The truth, as ever, lies in a tangle of both acceptance and quiet resentment, voices lost in the soot and silence of history. You feel the weight of this expectation as you move through your days. At breakfast, your husband clears his throat, hinting at the hope of a son. At church, the minister preaches about fruitful unions. At home, servants whisper about how quickly you will fill the nursery. Your body, once your own, is now treated, like communal property, the subject of speculation, advice, and scrutiny. Even strangers feel free to comment, to smile knowingly, as if your future is written not in your mind, but in your belly. And yet, amid the solemnity, there are flickers of humor. You recall a neighbor who bore child after child, each with hair redder than the last, until people joked that the family line could ignite a coal mine by standing too close together. You laugh softly at the memory, though behind the laughter is fatigue, for beneath the jokes lies the unspoken truth. Every one of those births carried risk. Every child another test of endurance. At night, lying in the dark, you feel the pressure most keenly. You imagine the weight of an infant in your arms, the warmth of small fingers, the sweetness of soft breaths. You also imagine the cold reality of fever, of loss, of your own body worn thin by endless expectation. You are caught between tenderness and terror, between hope and dread, between the dream of motherhood and the fear of what it will cost. This is the Victorian bargain. To be a wife is to be a mother, to bear children as proof of your duty, your respectability, your value. And as you stare at the ceiling beams above your bed, you cannot help but wonder how long your body can carry the weight of expectation before it buckles under the strain. You begin to notice the cracks, not just in the walls of your home, but in the fragile facade of fidelity that Victorian marriage is supposed to represent. By day, everything looks proper. Curtains drawn back, respectable dinners, polite bows in the street. But behind those doors, whispers travel faster than coal smoke, and hidden infidelities coil through households like smoke in a flue. Your husband may come home late, his coat smelling faintly of tobacco that is not his brand, a trace of perfume that no respectable matron in your circle would wear. You do not ask, because questions are dangerous things. To accuse is to admit you suspect, and suspicion itself can stain a wife more deeply than a husband's actual wandering. So, you smooth the tablecloth, pour the tea, and carry on as though nothing stirs beneath the surface. It is no secret that men were freer in their straying. A gentleman could visit clubs, taverns, or even discreet establishments on the wrong side of town, and society would raise an eyebrow, but rarely more. For women, the rules were merciless. A wife caught in an affair risked not only scandal, but ruin, loss of reputation, loss of children, loss of every shred of respectability she had been forced to build her life upon. The double standard was sharp, cruel, and unrelenting. Even in the great houses, with their gilt mirrors and velvet curtains, rumours flourished. Servants carried stories from kitchen to parlour, overheard conversations and sightings woven into gossip that spread across the neighbourhood. A carriage parked too long outside a discreet townhouse. A letter slipped into the wrong pocket. A chance encounter in a park. These were sparks that could ignite entire scandals. You begin to realize that marriage in this world is not only about what you live, but also about what others think you live. There is a peculiar detail you stumble upon in conversation. Some husbands, especially among the wealthier classes, installed secret staircases or hidden doors within their townhouses, designed for discreet entrances and exits. Imagine a velvet curtained drawing room where one panel in the wall opens to reveal a narrow stair, the perfect passage for lovers or for slipping away unnoticed. You cannot help but marvel at the absurdity. Architecture itself bending to accommodate. Infidelity as though the house conspired in the betrayal. Historians still argue whether the frequency of these affairs was exaggerated by scandal-hungry newspapers, or whether infidelity was indeed as common as the rumours suggest. Some accounts insist that the majority of marriages, though loveless, remained outwardly faithful simply because the risks of discovery were too steep. Others point to diaries, letters, and even court records that reveal a society rife with hidden liaisons, fueled by repression and secrecy. Perhaps the truth is both. Many dreamed, some strayed, and nearly all lived under the suspicion of it. You feel it in the atmosphere of your own marriage, the silences that stretch too long, the way your husband avoids your eyes when certain names are mentioned, the careful way letters are folded and tucked away. Perhaps he strays, perhaps he does not. Perhaps you never know for certain. But the doubt itself becomes a companion at your table, sitting beside you with every meal, whispering, in the quiet of the night, and what of yourself? You have moments when your heart stirs elsewhere, at the kindness of a neighbour, the laughter of a family friend, the warmth of someone who sees you not as a wife or a mother, but as a person. Yet you bury those feelings deep, because even a flicker of them, if discovered, would bring ruin crashing down on you. So you smile, you nod, you carry on, and you dream only in silence. This is the hidden life of Victorian marriage. A surface polished to perfection, while beneath it, cracks run jagged and deep. Affairs may be whispered about, but never acknowledged, carried out in shadows and silence. And you, standing in the middle of it, realize that fidelity in this age is less about love and loyalty and more about secrecy, about how well one can hide the truth while smiling across the dinner table. The veneer of respectability that coats your marriage like a layer of thick varnish cannot conceal the dangers lurking beneath. For all the sermons on purity and the endless reminders that women must guard their virtue, disease slithers quietly through Victorian households, carried on whispered secrets and hidden encounters. Behind lace curtains and polite conversation, a silent epidemic stalks wives and children alike. You sit by the fire one evening, darning stockings, while your husband returns late once more, cheeks flushed from drink, his voice too loud in the hall. You try not to notice the scent that follows him, the faint mixture of smoke, spirits, and something indefinably foreign. Later, when illness begins to creep into your body, there will be no acknowledgement of where it came from. No one will speak the truth aloud, that venereal disease stalks the city, spreading not in brothels alone, but into marriages, into nurseries, into lives wrapped in respectability. London at night is a different city, alive with gas lamps, hansom cabs, and the steady trade of prostitution. Estimates suggested tens of thousands of women walked the streets, some as young as 12, their lives reduced to survival in the face of poverty. Men, gentlemen, clerks, soldiers, visited them, and then returned home to their wives, who bore the consequences in silence. It was a grim irony. Women branded as fallen provided temporary escape for men, but the shame and sickness were carried back to those who were supposedly virtuous. There is a curious detail that makes the hypocrisy sharper still. In some military garrisons, doctors regularly examined prostitutes for disease, attempting to keep the army clean. Wives, however, were never afforded the same protections. No doctor knocked on your door to ensure your husband had not brought something home to you. Respectability, it seemed, was its own punishment, leaving women at greater risk precisely because they were respectable. Historians still debate how widespread these infections truly were among the middle classes. Some argue that the dangers have been exaggerated, that sensational newspapers painted lurid pictures to sell copies. Others point to medical records, to case notes of physicians who quietly treated wives suffering from illnesses they could never have contracted on their own. What cannot be denied is the fear that rippled through households, the knowledge, even if unspoken, that marriage was not the shield it pretended to be. And the moralists, of course, were relentless. Pamphlets warned women to remain pure, as though their virtue could protect them from the choices of their husbands. The blame for disease was twisted, pinned upon wives for not being dutiful enough, upon fallen women for existing at all, rarely upon men who carried it from one world to the next. You feel the injustice of it settle into your bones as you fold away the stockings, as you force yourself to smile across the dinner table, as you lie awake at night with fear whispering beneath the sheets. Still, amid the bleakness, strange anecdotes surface. There were households where wives, desperate for remedies, turned to bizarre treatments, mercury pills that poisoned more than they cured, herbal concoctions sold in secret, or even electric belts advertised as restoring vitality. Imagine strapping a contraption of wires and batteries around your waist, praying it might rid you of an illness you never sought. It borders on the absurd, and yet it was real desperation, the only option left when the truth could not be spoken. You wonder as you sit in the dim light, whether love could ever survive such silence. Could you look into your husband's eyes and trust him again? Could affection endure when your very health trembled on the edge of his choices? Perhaps some couples found a way. Perhaps kindness and denial wove a fragile peace. Or perhaps many simply endured, too afraid of scandal, too bound by law and custom to break free. In the end, disease becomes another shadow of Victorian marriage, unseen, unspoken, but devastating. Respectability might protect your reputation, but it cannot shield your body. And as you fold the stockings one last time, lay them neatly in the drawer, and blow out the candle, you know that silence itself may be the most dangerous contagion of all. Respectability still clings to you like a second skin, but beneath it, the hypocrisy glares so brightly it almost blinds. Victorian society preached purity, restraint, and sacred duty, but the reality within marriages was far from equal. Men roamed, women endured, and the double standards that governed fidelity were so sharp they could cut a person to ribbons. You sit at the parlor window one afternoon, embroidery hoop balanced on your lap, listening to neighbors chatter below. A man's indiscretions are being discussed with laughter, indulgent chuckles about how boys will be boys. The same neighbors who forgive a husband for wandering would destroy a wife for even a hint of impropriety. One misstep, one letter discovered, one glance held too long, and she would be branded forever as fallen, cast out of polite company like yesterday's ash from the grate. This is the cruel paradox. Men's sins were excused, even expected, while women's smallest errors became unforgivable crimes. A husband might spend nights at clubs, gamble, drink, or even frequent brothels, and still be greeted respectfully at church on Sunday morning. A wife, meanwhile, risked her reputation for something as harmless as walking unchaperoned with a man not her relative. Society's scales were weighted so heavily against her that even innocence could be twisted into guilt by rumor alone. The press played its part in deepening these double standards. Court cases involving women's supposed indiscretions made excellent copy for hungry readers. A single scandal involving a wife could fill entire columns, her name dissected, her every gesture scrutinized. Husbands in similar positions often escaped with their dignity intact, their names omitted or softened by euphemism. The injustice is so blatant that you feel it hum beneath your skin like static, impossible to ignore. There is a strange, almost comical quirk in this world of hypocrisy. Some husbands actually paraded their mistresses openly, bringing them to the opera or to country houses, confident that society would merely smirk and look away. Imagine sitting in a gilded theatre box, opera glasses pressed to your eyes, while across the hall another man displays his lover with pride, his wife seated dutifully on his other side. You can almost hear the whispered jokes, the restrained laughter, the quiet sighs of wives who knew their turn to be humiliated might come tomorrow. Historians still wrestle with the question of how complicit society was in maintaining these double standards. Did people truly believe men's failings were harmless? Or was it a collective charade, a way of preserving appearances while everyone knew better? Diaries reveal frustration, wives lamenting the injustice, men sometimes acknowledging the cruelty but rarely challenging it. Perhaps the truth is that hypocrisy was easier than change, and so the double standard survived, polished and repeated until it seemed unshakable. You feel it most sharply at night, when your husband returns late and you force yourself to smile, to ask no questions. You know that even if his behavior were obvious, you would bear the brunt of shame should the truth come out. It would be you whispered about, you judged, you shunned, not him. The unfairness is suffocating, and yet you swallow it, because survival demands silence. So you smooth the bedclothes, you extinguish the lamp, you lie awake in the dark. The hypocrisy gnaws at you, sharper than hunger, heavier than exhaustion. Victorian marriage was built not on fairness, but on rules designed to protect men and condemn women. And as you stare at the ceiling beams, you realize that the house itself seems complicit, sheltering secrets on one side while exposing imagined sins on the other. The glow of the hearth casts long shadows across the parlor, but the warmth does little to quiet the unease you carry inside. You've learned to endure your husband's absences, his silences, the hypocrisy of a world that forgives him everything while binding you with invisible chains. Yet here lies a cruelty sharper still. The law itself stands with him, not you. If he raises his voice, his hand, or worse, there is almost nothing you can do. Victorian England wrapped marriage in lofty words: sanctity, devotion, duty. But within the walls of homes, countless wives endured cruelty with no recourse. A husband might strike, berate, or confine his wife, and the law would often look the other way. Police were reluctant to interfere in domestic matters. Magistrates turned stern faces toward wives who complained, and society muttered that a woman should be patient, obedient, forgiving. Pain was privatized, hidden beneath lace curtains and respectable facades. You sit quietly, remembering the neighbor's house down the street. Whispers carried that the husband had a temper, that his wife sometimes appeared at church with shadows under her eyes. She blamed on fainting spells. Everyone knew, no one spoke. To acknowledge cruelty was to tear open the illusion of marital harmony, and illusions were precious currency in this age. Silence was safer. For them, not for her. The injustice of property law sharpens the cruelty. Your dowry, your possessions, even your wages if you earn any, belong to him. Should he decide to lock you out, you could find yourself penniless, standing in the rain with nowhere to go. Charitable institutions might take you in, but their walls carried shame as heavy as stone. Respectability could vanish overnight, and, with it every support you once relied upon. Amid this bleakness, an unsettling quirk emerges. Some men, desperate to control their wives even further, threatened them with confinement in asylums. The Victorian asylum, with its barred windows and hushed corridors, became a looming threat in arguments. Obey, or be declared hysterical. And society, steeped in ideas of women's fragility, often sided with the husband. Imagine living with the knowledge that a disagreement over money, religion, or even reading too many novels might be twisted into grounds for madness. The walls of your own home feel less like shelter and more like a waiting room for a prison you cannot see. Historians still argue about how common such abuses were. Some emphasize that not every household was tyrannical, that tenderness existed, that many men treated their wives with kindness and affection. Others insist that cruelty was widespread, but hidden, woven into the silence and shame of Victorian society. The truth lingers somewhere in the middle. Countless women lived quietly under gentle husbands, but countless others endured a darkness that was rarely acknowledged in public. You realize this as you sit by the fire, hands folded tightly. In your lap, respectability keeps you from speaking, law keeps you from escaping, and fear keeps you from resisting. You wonder how many wives lie awake tonight with similar thoughts, staring at ceilings, flinching at footsteps, praying for dawn. And yet, life carries on. Tomorrow, you will host tea, smiling for neighbors who never see the bruises of silence. Tomorrow, you will mend, clean, perform the endless tasks of marriage, all while carrying the knowledge that the law is not yours to call upon. In this world, cruelty is not an aberration, but a possibility sanctioned by silence. And you live each day knowing the boundaries of your cage extend further than even your own imagination can reach. The bells of Sunday morning toll across the city, and as their iron voices echo through the streets, you feel the invisible grip of the church tighten around your life. It is not only your husband who claims authority over you, nor only the law that binds you. It is also faith, sewn into every hymn, every sermon, every whispered reminder that marriage is less a choice than a sacred duty. You sit in a pew that smells of damp wood and polish, hands folded in your lap, while the vicar speaks of obedience. His words are not directed at you alone, but you feel them settle on your shoulders like a weight nonetheless. Wives must submit to their husbands, he declares. Marriage is holy, indissoluble, the foundation of Christian society. You lower your gaze, because to look up might reveal too much. Your weariness, your doubt, the growing sense that duty has eclipsed desire. For Victorians, the church was more than faith. It was structure, authority, expectation. Marriage was presented as a sacrament, a contract made not only with your husband, but before God himself. To falter was not just to risk scandal, it was to risk damnation. And so you obey, not only because society insists, but because your soul is said to hang in the balance. There is something strangely theatrical about these sermons, the way they transform your private life into a cosmic drama. Arguments over money, quarrels about affection, even the ache of loneliness, all of it is swept into language of eternal consequence. You may suffer in silence, but your silence is painted as holy patience, your endurance as virtue. The bruises you hide beneath your sleeves become trials of faith, your tears at night prayers unspoken. And yet, amid the solemnity, peculiar details emerge. In some rural parishes, vicars were said to keep detailed records not only of marriages and baptisms, but also of quarrels they mediated between husbands and wives. Imagine your private grievances scrawled into a parish ledger, sitting alongside births and deaths, as though your misery was simply another statistic in the life of the community. The thought makes you shiver and laugh bitterly at the same time. Historians still debate whether religion in this era brought comfort to wives or deepened their chains. Some accounts suggest that faith gave women strength, framing their suffering as meaningful, offering the promise of reward in heaven, if not on earth. Others argue that the Church's constant emphasis on duty and obedience only entrenched inequality, sanctifying silence and submission while condemning any rebellion as sin. Perhaps the truth lies in both. Faith could soothe, but it also bound, its hymns carrying balm in one note and shackles in the next. Back home, the echoes of the sermon linger. Your husband sits in the armchair, paper spread before him, while you prepare the Sunday roast, the words of the vicar running through your mind. To question your husband's choices would be to question God's order. To refuse his demands would be to defy sacred vows. Even your thoughts feel dangerous, as though heaven itself listens at the keyhole. In the quiet of the evening, you kneel by your bed, whispering prayers you scarcely believe in anymore. You ask for patience, for peace, for a gentleness that never seems to arrive. You pray because it is what is expected, because you are told it is your duty, because you have no other outlet for the heaviness that fills your chest. And as you rise, blowing out the candle, you wonder, is this faith or fear? The Church's grip is steady, constant, unyielding. It tells you that your suffering is sacred, your silence holy, your endurance divine. And so you continue, day after day, caught between belief and doubt, obedience and despair, knowing that in Victorian England, even God seems to side with your husband. The clang of carriage wheels fades into the distance, and the evening air settles heavy with smoke from the chimneys. Inside your home, beneath the gilt-framed pictures and carefully arranged furniture, you are struck by a truth that has been lurking all along. Class decides the shape of your marriage just as surely as vows or laws. Whether you are rich or poor, the cage is still there. It is only gilded differently. If you belong to the wealthier classes, your world is padded with velvet, lined with etiquette, smothered in rituals of respectability. You live in houses with tall windows and polished floors, your life measured in teas, calls, and the endless choreography of social visits. To outsiders, you appear blessed, silks rustling as you enter a drawing room, servants gliding to bring trays of delicacies. But beneath the satin, your marriage is as much a bargain as any, arranged with ledgers and family alliances. Comfort hides control. You may not scrub your own floors, but you still scrub your soul to keep it spotless in the eyes of others. If you belong to the working classes, the story is grimmer, stripped of the sheen of respectability. Your days are filled with labor, your nights with exhaustion. You rise before dawn to light the fire, to cook, to wash, to stitch, while your husband shoulders his tools and heads for the factory, the dock, the mine. You live cheek by jowl with neighbors in crowded streets, damp walls weeping with mildew, the cries of children blending with the noise of carts and hawkers. In such homes, marriage is not lace and tea, it is survival, a joint struggle against hunger and cold. And yet both cages echo with the same refrain: duty. For the rich, duty to family reputation. For the poor, duty to survival. You cannot escape it, no matter which side of the social divide you inhabit. A curious detail reveals the absurdity of this divide. Among the wealthy, servants were often given strict instructions to arrange meals not only by time, but by sound. Tea trays rattled with just the right amount of clink. Footsteps softened to a whisper on carpets. Among the poor, meals were often taken standing, crowded around a single pot on a rough table, everyone dipping spoons into the same stew. Two worlds, two rituals, both equally scripted in their own way. Historians still argue over which marriages were harder, those of the wealthy, suffocated by etiquette, or those of the poor, crushed by poverty. Some suggest the rich endured emotional prisons, trapped in loveless unions, but cushioned by comfort. Others insist the poor bore the heavier burden, their lives shortened by labor, their marriages consumed by survival. Perhaps it is not a question of which was worse, but of how suffering wears different masks in different homes. You walk through your parlor, fingers brushing the polished wood, and wonder what it would feel like to live without these expectations pressing down. If you were poor, would you be freer despite the hardship? Or is freedom always an illusion, as fleeting as the sound of the carriage fading down the cobbled street? The fire burns low, the air thick with coal dust, and you realize that no matter the class, Victorian marriage leaves little room for choice, little room for self. Whether rich or poor, your role has already been written, your life bound by duty, dressed either in velvet or in rags. The front door slams, footsteps echo through the hall, and a hush falls over the house. Life in a Victorian marriage is rarely lived by two people alone. Behind every couple, whether wealthy or merely scraping by, stand the watchful eyes and quick hands of servants. Their presence is constant, quiet, and impossible to ignore. They hear, they see, they know, and though society pretends that marriage is a private bond between husband and wife, in truth, it is crowded with witnesses who carry the secrets of the household like invisible baggage. If you are wealthy enough, servants are woven into every corner of your life. The maid helps lace your gown each morning, tugging the strings so tightly you can scarcely breathe. The cook prepares meals to impress visitors, her labor hidden behind swinging doors. The coachman drives you through the city, hearing every clipped word exchanged in the carriage. Even the scullery maid, on her knees scrubbing soot from the hearth, catches fragments of arguments that drift down the stairs. Your marriage is never yours alone. It is performed daily before an audience that cleans your linens, polishes your spoons, and notes every silence at the dinner table. For the poor, the situation is different, yet strangely similar. You may not have servants, but you live so close to neighbors that privacy is just as elusive. Thin walls carry arguments into the next room. Lodgers share your space, and gossip moves through streets as quickly as coal smoke in a draft. Respectability depends not on secrecy, but on how well you convince others you are coping. Even the smallest cracks in your marriage become common knowledge by morning. There is something almost comical about how much servants witnessed in the wealthier homes. One quirky detail often mentioned in memoirs of service is the peculiar job of warming beds. A maid would slip a brass pan filled with hot coals between the sheets to take the chill away before her employers retired. But while warming the bed, she might overhear conversations, catch sight of gestures, sense tensions. Imagine preparing a room for intimacy you yourself will never know, your hands moving briskly, while your ears record secrets that no diary could safely contain. Historians still debate the role servants played in shaping or even protecting marriages. Some argue that their loyalty preserved reputations, that silence was part of their duty. Others suggest that servants held real power, that their gossip could topple facades, that their testimony in court during scandals made them both feared and indispensable. The truth likely lies somewhere between. The delicate balance of dependence and mistrust, intimacy and distance, a relationship as complex as any within the family itself. You notice it most in small moments. The way the butler clears his throat just before entering a tense room. The way the maid looks down quickly when your husband raises his voice. The way the cook insists on sending up broth to soothe your nerves after a quarrel. Their gestures reveal that they know more than they say, that your marriage is not a secret fortress, but a stage with invisible spectators lining the wings, and you feel the weight of it. Every word you speak, every silence you hold, every gesture you make becomes part of a performance, not just for society outside, but for the staff within. You wonder sometimes if they pity you, if they judge you, if they tell stories in the servants' hall at night. Perhaps they do. Perhaps your life, with all its struggles and silences, is just another tale passed along with laughter and sighs over mugs of weak tea. In Victorian England, servants were the hidden witnesses to marriage, the quiet chorus in the background of every argument, every reconciliation, every weary silence. They knew the truth behind the curtains of respectability, truths you could never admit aloud. And as you sit in your chair by the fire, listening to footsteps retreat down the hall, you realize that your marriage is never only between two people. It is a story lived in front of others, guarded and gossiped about, preserved and betrayed by the very people who smooth your sheets and light your lamps. The house feels larger now, though not because the rooms have grown. It is because he is gone. Your husband, carried out in a coffin of polished oak, the air heavy with lilies and murmured condolences. Widowhood has arrived, and with it a strange hollow quiet. But the silence is not freedom. In Victorian England, widowhood is another cage, painted in different colours, wrapped in layers of respect and suspicion. From the moment the black veil is drawn over your face, society shifts how it looks at you. You are no longer wife, yet not free either. You are expected to mourn with dignity, to dress in shades of grief, to wear sorrow like a uniform. Queen Victoria herself set the standard, retreating into black after Prince Albert's death in 1861, and remaining in mourning for the rest of her life. Her grief became the model, and every widow thereafter was measured against her endless black dresses, her solemn face, her refusal to step back into light. You wake each morning to fabrics that scratch and weigh upon you, bombazine, crepe, heavy black silk. For a year at least, society demands deep mourning, and even after, you may only soften to grey or lavender. Jewellery, if you wear it, is made from jet or from the braided hair of the deceased, tokens both tender and macabre. Imagine pinning a brooch to your collar that holds a lock of hair, worn close to your heart yet forever, a reminder of loss. And then there are the rules. You must avoid certain gatherings, certain colours, certain laughter. You must embody dignity, patience, restraint. Too much joy is suspect, too much sorrow, suffocating. People watch you, judge you, whisper whether your grief is proper. Widowhood is not private, it is performance, as much a stage as courtship or marriage ever was. There is a curious detail whispered among society's gossips. Widows were often seen as dangerously appealing. Freed from the legal control of husbands, they had more independence than married women, and that independence made them both intriguing and suspect. Suitors sometimes circled quickly, eager to claim the wealth or property a widow controlled. At the same time, neighbours muttered about impropriety if she remarried too soon. It was a tightrope walk, one that left women feeling both powerful and perilously exposed. Historians still argue whether widowhood granted women more freedom or merely another layer of constraint. Some argue that widows gained agency, able to manage property, make decisions, even live independently in ways denied to wives. Others insist that society's scrutiny smothered this independence, that widows remained bound by mourning rituals and expectations that shaped every choice. The truth, as so often, is tangled. Freedom came wrapped in black fabric, edged with suspicion, and every widow's path was different. You feel the weight of it as you sit in your parlour, draped in black, listening to the clock tick too loudly. Letters arrive with condolences written in careful hands. Neighbors call with cakes and solemn faces, and through it all, you are expected to embody grief gracefully. But grief is not graceful. It is heavy, messy, uneven, and beneath the sorrow lies the sharp knowledge that even now, your choices are not your own. Perhaps you consider remarriage, if only to secure protection or companionship. Perhaps you long for solitude, for space to breathe. Either way, society watches, waiting to judge. Widowhood is not a blank page. It is another chapter already written by others, and you are forced to read the lines aloud with every step you take in black shoes down the cobbled street. The fire crackles in the grate, but the warmth does little to chase away the hollowness inside you. Widowhood has taught you to live in silence, but now you discover another truth. Even when you were a wife, you were living in the shadow of stories not your own. Victorian marriage was built not only on laws and duties, but on myths, romantic fiction spun in books, sermons, and sentimental poems that painted a life you rarely saw reflected in your own. You think of the novels stacked neatly on the parlor table, their gilt edges catching the light. They speak of gentle courtships, of noble suitors, of heroines who are virtuous yet adored. You turn their pages at night, the words flowing like a lullaby, and you wonder, where in those tales is the suffocating silence of daily life? Where is the weight of endless pregnancies, the sting of hypocrisy, the loneliness that grows heavier with each passing year? The stories promise affection, even passion. But what you live is duty wrapped in respectability. The gap between myth and reality stretches wide. Young girls, clutching books in their laps, dream of love that will lift them out of drudgery, of husbands who will see them as equals. But once the vows are spoken, the dream cracks, and they find themselves sewing hems in candlelight, their laughter dulled, their choices gone. You were one of them once, your heart swelling at stories of love. Now you know better. Now you know the novels left out the silence. And yet, myths shape lives as surely as laws. Families believed in them, repeating lines about blessed unions and domestic harmony. Ministers preached them, turning them into sermons. Even newspapers printed tales of happy couples as models of society. Respectability depended on maintaining the illusion, on pretending that the stories matched the truth. And so wives smiled through clenched teeth, husbands bowed stiffly at dinners, and both carried on the great performance of happiness among. The myths are peculiar details, half sweet, half absurd. Lovers exchanged tokens of devotion shaped like hearts, hands or doves, rings, brooches, lockets, symbols of eternal affection. One popular gift was jewelry made from human hair, woven into intricate patterns, a literal piece of oneself given as proof of love. You can imagine a young bride clutching a locket of braided strands, pressing it to her lips, believing it guaranteed devotion forever. It is tender, yes, but faintly eerie, a promise wrapped in something that does not decay, even when the marriage itself grows hollow. Historians still argue about whether these myths were harmless illusions or tools of control. Some suggest they gave women hope, helping them endure hardship by holding on to the idea of love. Others argue they served to mask oppression, making women believe they were failing if their marriages did not resemble the novels and sermons. Perhaps both are true. Stories offered comfort, but they also blinded. They lulled generations into accepting cages because the bars were painted with poetry. You close the book on your lap and stare at the fire. The heroine within its pages finds joy, fulfillment, love. You glance around your room, the silence, the duties, the lingering weight of expectation, and you know the truth is far different. Victorian marriage was never the myth. It was the space between the lines, the words left unspoken, the lives lived in shadows while novels promised light, and as the fire burns low, you tuck the book aside, sighing softly. You are left with the same realization that grows sharper each day. The romantic myths may comfort, but they do not reflect the life you live. They are stories for the parlor table, not the heart. The whispers always arrive before the truth. They creep in through the cracks of drawing rooms, drift down the corridors of Parliament, and splash across the inky pages of newspapers hungry for scandal. In Victorian England, when a marriage began to break apart, or a husband and wife found themselves tangled in accusations, it was not simply a private misery, it was a public feast. You can picture it easily. A court case unfolding. The gallery crowded not with concerned relatives, but with strangers craning their necks for entertainment. Divorce trials, adultery accusations, even disputes over inheritance, all became spectacles. Papers printed every sordid detail, sometimes word for word, the testimonies of wives and husbands laid bare for the breakfast tables of strangers. What was whispered in your bedroom yesterday might be laughed over at someone else's tea table today. For wives, the risk was especially brutal. A man exposed for infidelity might suffer a bruise to his reputation, but he could still walk into his club the next day, order port, and be greeted with sympathetic nods. A woman accused, no matter how small the evidence, was ruined. Neighbors would cross the street to avoid her. Friends would fall silent. Even her children might be turned against her. Respectability once cracked could never be glued back together. It is chilling to think of the way society consumed these scandals. Editors competed for the most salacious coverage, sometimes embellishing, sometimes mocking. A headline might hint at a lady's disgrace, while the story inside offered paragraphs of insinuation and moralizing. And yet, the very people who clutched their pearls at the impropriety were the same who eagerly turned the pages for more. Respectability thrived on the scandals it pretended to despise. In the midst of this, curious details emerge. Some trials became so popular that seats in the courtroom were sold, as though attending a broken marriage were no different than going to the theatre. Ladies in fine bonnets and gentlemen with monocles jostled for a place. Their curiosity piqued, not by justice, but by the thrill of watching lives unravel in public. You almost want to laugh at the absurdity. The ruin of a household treated as a social outing, complete with murmurs of gossip as though the proceedings were an opera. Historians still debate whether these scandals ultimately harmed the institution of marriage or strengthened it. Some argue that public trials exposed hypocrisy, revealing just how fragile the supposed sanctity of marriage really was. Others believe the opposite, that by punishing wives so harshly and ridiculing them in print, society reinforced its strict moral codes. Perhaps it was both, a spectacle that at once fascinated and terrified, entertaining the masses while warning them never to stray too far from duty. You imagine the terror of waking one morning to find your own name in black print, your private life turned into breakfast conversation across the city. A quarrel whispered in your bedroom, a letter you thought destroyed, a glance misinterpreted. All could be twisted into fuel for the press. And even if the accusations were false, the stain would linger. The ink on newsprint faded quickly, but the whispers it carried clung for years. So you carry yourself carefully, smiling just enough, speaking just enough, ensuring that nothing in your manner could ever be fodder for a scandal sheet. Yet the fear lingers, as persistent as the coal soot on your window panes. The knowledge that one slip, one whisper, one careless word could unravel everything. In Victorian England, marriage was never simply between two people. It was a contract with society, and society was always watching, always ready to turn your sorrow into a headline. The streets outside glisten with rain, gas lamps shimmering on the slick cobblestones, and you feel that peculiar heaviness of Victorian respectability pressing in from all sides. Marriage here is not only a bond between husband and wife, it is a public institution, a scaffold holding up the moral image of society itself. To stumble in marriage is not just to fall privately, but to be dragged, face first, across the polished tiles of social judgment. Every morning you perform your part. The dress must be neat, the curtains drawn just so, the table set with the proper silver. If the roast burns or the tablecloth shows a stain, you fear neighbors will whisper, "She cannot manage her home." But if your husband's voice carries, in anger, or if you appear in church with tired eyes, they will whisper anyway. Respectability is not built on truth, but on appearances, and appearances must be kept as carefully as fires in the grate. This facade is not just personal, it is national. Politicians, preachers, pamphleteers, all trumpet the family as the bedrock of Britain's greatness. A strong empire, they insist, rests on strong households, disciplined wives, and obedient children. Marriage becomes propaganda. Every tidy parlour and polite dinner table is a miniature stage where the empire itself is rehearsed. Your quiet endurance is woven into the story of conquest and progress, even though your name will never appear in the ledgers of history. And yet, you know the truth. Behind closed doors, countless homes rattle with quarrels, loneliness, betrayals. Respectability hides as much as it reveals. Still, society clings to its illusions, for illusions are safer than admitting the fragility beneath. One curious detail captures the absurdity of this obsession. There were etiquette manuals sold cheaply, in bookstores, instructing couples how to behave not only in public, but in private. When to speak, how to sit, even how to laugh. Imagine leafing through a little book that tells you not to show too much enthusiasm at your own dinner table, lest it be seen as uncouth. You chuckle at the thought, though the humour is edged with despair. Even laughter must be choreographed, if the household is to appear respectable. Historians still argue about whether this culture of appearances strengthened marriages or destroyed them. Some insist that by forcing couples to maintain civility, it preserved order, preventing chaos from spilling out. Others argue it hollowed marriage from within, turning real intimacy into a stage play where no one dared speak the truth. The evidence lies scattered in diaries and letters, some filled with tenderness and gratitude, others with silence so loud it echoes still. Tonight, as the rain patters against the window, you pull your shawl tighter and stare at the glow of the lamp. Respectability feels less like honor and more like armor, heavy and suffocating. You play your role because society demands it, because survival depends on it. But inside, you know the performance is not for you. It is for them, the neighbors, the church, the empire itself. And when the curtain falls each night, and the house sinks into silence, you are left alone with the aching truth that respectability is a mask you cannot remove. Section 21, Part 2. Morning comes, and with it, the ritual of performance begins again. You dress not only for yourself, but for the eyes of others, as if the lace at your collar or the polish on your boots could testify to the soundness of your marriage. The maid draws back the curtains. Neighbors glance at your windows, and already, the play has resumed. At church, you notice how keenly people watch. They measure not just your gown, but the tilt of your head, the distance you stand from your husband, whether you exchange glances or avoid them. Even the way you pass the hymn book becomes evidence. Respectability thrives on minutiae, turning ordinary gestures into moral judgments. You smile at the absurdity of it, though the smile is tired. Your entire existence has been reduced to a series of carefully rehearsed poses. Afternoons bring visits, neighbors, relatives, acquaintances. You pour tea, hand out slices of sponge cake, ask after their health, and all the while you feel the tension beneath the pleasantries. These visits are less about friendship than surveillance. They glance around the parlor, noting whether the curtains are mended, whether the silver is polished, whether your smile holds. Every crumb on the carpet, every chip in the china is a clue in the ongoing investigation of your respectability. And in the evenings, when the lamps are lit and the fire glows, you play your part once more. The husband reads the paper. You sew. Quietly, children, if you have them, are ushered to bed. Anyone looking in through the window would see harmony, order, calm. No one would hear the silences that stretch between you, or the arguments stifled into whispers. Respectability, after all, has no room for dissonance. There is one curious detail about these performances that makes you shake your head. Some households hired visiting cards, printed with elaborate designs, which they left in trays at acquaintances' homes. These little slips of paper acted like tokens of reputation, announcing that one had called, that one belonged to respectable circles. A card left in the wrong place or forgotten altogether could start rumors as easily as a scandal. Imagine your entire social standing reduced to a rectangle of pasteboard with your name etched in gilt. Historians still debate whether this culture of appearances ultimately held Victorian society together or slowly suffocated it. Some claim that respectability provided a structure that preserved order in a rapidly industrializing world where chaos lurked just beyond the city streets. Others argue that it hollowed people out, replacing genuine relationships with performances, intimacy with masks. The truth seems to linger in both. The order was real, but so was the loneliness that lay behind the curtains. And you, caught in the midst of it, feel the endless tug between appearance and truth. By day, you shine your mask, smiling at neighbors, tending to rituals. By night, you lie awake, staring at the ceiling beams, knowing that none of it reflects your heart. Victorian marriage is not just a bond. It is a theatre, a stage where every gesture is a line, every smile a costume. And you, whether you wish it or not, are the leading actor in a play that never ends. The streets of London grow noisier each year, omnibuses rattling over cobblestones, the hiss of steam engines, hawkers crying their wares. And within this restless din, the very shape of marriage begins to shift. Industrial progress, reform debates, the slow march of modernity, all creep into the parlor and the kitchen, nudging at traditions that once seemed unshakable. You sit at the table, letter spread before you, the ink still glistening. It is a pamphlet, passed from hand to hand, written by campaigners who speak daringly of reform. They question the laws that bind wives to their husbands. They argue for property rights. They whisper of education and independence. The words feel dangerous, almost scandalous, but they awaken something in you. If women can petition for change, then perhaps marriage itself is not carved in stone. Around you, evidence of progress flickers. The Married Women's Property Acts, debated in Parliament and gradually passed, begin to chip away at the idea that a wife owns nothing. Slowly, haltingly, women are granted the right to keep earnings, to inherit property, to have something, in their name besides their husbands. It is not full equality, far from it, but it is a spark. You clutch the pamphlet tighter, as though the paper itself might catch flame in your hands. Still, change does not come quietly. Many decry these reforms as threats to the very fabric of society. Editorials thunder that if women control property, households will collapse, marriages will crumble, chaos will reign. Dinner conversations turn sharp. Neighbors argue in hushed tones. You realize that every reform is not only a matter of law, but a matter of identity, reshaping what it means to be wife, husband, family. And amid these debates, peculiar details surface. In some reform meetings, women wore symbolic pins shaped like arrows or tiny books, emblems of independence. Imagine a room filled with earnest faces, shawls pinned with little tokens, the air humming with speeches and suppressed laughter. It is both solemn and faintly whimsical, the quiet rebellion of accessories in a world that weighs every stitch of fabric with meaning. Historians still wrestle with the question of how far these reforms truly transformed marriage. Some argue they mark the dawn of change, planting seeds that would eventually grow into greater freedoms. Others insist they were symbolic gestures, offering small concessions while leaving the core inequalities untouched. Diaries of women in this period reflect both. The thrill of small victories, the frustration that the cage remained even as a few bars were loosened. You sense it yourself, hope and frustration entwined. The pamphlets inspire, the laws shift, slightly, but daily life remains heavy. Your husband still holds sway, neighbors still watch, duty still dictates, and yet, the whisper of reform lingers. A reminder that the world is not entirely immovable, that cracks can form even in stone. Tonight, as you tuck the pamphlet into the drawer, you smile faintly. Victorian marriage still binds you, but beyond. Your walls, voices are rising. Perhaps in time, their echoes will reach even here. The reforms discussed in Parliament ripple outward, stirring drawing rooms and kitchens alike. Some husbands scoff, dismissing them as irrelevant, but others grow, anxious, as though the very walls of their authority tremble. You can feel it when conversations grow sharper, when the evening paper arrives with another article, its ink smelling faintly of coal smoke and fear. Change, however small, unsettles those who benefit from silence. In your own circle, reactions differ. One friend whispers with excitement, telling you she has hidden coins from her sewing work in a box beneath the floorboard, testing the idea that a woman might truly keep her own earnings. Another insists that these new laws are dangerous, that they will unravel marriages, leaving wives untethered and families broken. Between the two of them, you sense the tug of the entire era. Hope and dread pulling against each other, the future balanced on the edge of a quill. And then there are the contradictions. Reform promises more rights, yet society continues to bind women with etiquette and scrutiny. A wife may one day inherit her father's house, but if she walks alone in the street, eyebrows rise. She may legally own the sewing machine she bought, with her own wages, but she is still expected to hand the key to the household accounts to her husband. Progress creeps slowly, like ivy climbing a wall, beautiful but slow, and always tangled in tradition. There is one curious story you recall from a newspaper clipping. A woman who, having gained the right to her inheritance, purchased a parrot with her newfound independence. Neighbors laughed, calling it frivolous, but she walked proudly down the lane with the bird perched on her shoulder. It is a small act, almost comic, but deeply symbolic, a declaration that a woman could spend her own money on what pleased her, even if it was only a squawking creature in feathers of green and gold. Historians continue to debate whether such reforms were truly revolutionary or merely symbolic gestures meant to quiet unrest. Some point to the slow accumulation of rights as the beginning of a tidal wave, carrying women toward independence. Others argue that these changes were cosmetic, that real equality remained distant, that the fundamental imbalance of marriage endured untouched. And you, sitting by the window with the pamphlet hidden under your shawl, feel both truths in your bones. The cage is loosening, but it is still a cage. Night falls again, and you find yourself staring at the embers in the grate. You wonder what the world will look like for the girls who come after you. Will they sit in parlors, eyes downcast, bound by duty? Or will they stride into shops, into schools, into lives of their own choosing? You do not know, but you dare to hope. Even if the change does not come fully for you, perhaps the whispers of reform will carry further for them. For now, you fold the pamphlet once more, tuck it into the drawer, and smooth your skirt. Tomorrow, you will perform your role again. But tonight, for just a moment, you let yourself dream of a marriage that feels less like a contract and more like a choice. The city hums with restless energy, factories clattering, presses rolling, the sharp scent of ink drifting through the air. And with every sheet of paper printed, Victorian marriage is dissected anew. Newspapers, magazines, even cheap penny weeklies fill their columns with opinions, sermons, caricatures, and scandals, all turning the private world of husband and wife into public debate. You unfold a newspaper at the breakfast table, the paper smelling faintly of damp and smoke, and your eye catches a headline: "The sanctity of matrimony in peril." Another column, more sensational, declares, "Wife seeks divorce." The language swells with drama, as if the fate of civilization itself trembles with every unhappy union. The world seems determined to peer into the bedroom, to transform every quarrel, every scandal, every whisper into fodder for national conversation. Magazines aimed at women arrive in neat bundles, pages filled with advice on running a household, keeping a husband happy, raising children. Yet between the lines of recipes and sewing patterns lie quiet warnings. A good wife is patient, obedient, frugal, cheerful. If she fails, it is not marriage that falters, but she herself. You trace the words with your finger, realizing that respectability is not only enforced by neighbors and clergy, but mass-produced by printing presses, distributed with the morning bread. At the same time, satirical magazines like Punch lampoon marriage with cartoons, wives drawn as nagging, husbands as bumbling or straying, households turned into comic theatres. You laugh despite yourself, though the humour is edged with discomfort. Everyone knows the jokes reflect truths, but it is safer to laugh at ink on paper than to admit the same patterns in your own parlour. And then there are the pamphlets. Reformers publish treatises calling for change, arguing that women should have legal protection, that cruel husbands should not hide behind the sanctity of marriage. Moralists counter with their own tracts, warning that loosening the bonds of wedlock will unravel the empire. Pamphlets pile on pamphlets, each side declaring itself the voice of reason, each using marriage as the battlefield upon which larger wars of morality and modernity are fought. One curious detail lingers in your mind. Some newspapers actually printed columns of marriage advice sent in by anonymous readers, much like today's letters to editors. In one issue, a man complained that his wife read too many novels, while another wife confessed she could not keep her husband out of the tavern. Imagine a whole country snickering or sighing over strangers' marital woes, sipping tea while judging the confessions of people they would never meet. Historians continue to argue whether this flood of print helped marriages by airing grievances or harmed them by spreading fear and gossip. Some suggest it allowed women to see that they were not alone, that their struggles were shared. Others believe it reinforced impossible standards, holding up ideals that no one could reach while mocking those who failed. The printed word carried both comfort and cruelty, binding households together, even as it exposed their cracks. You fold the newspaper, lay it aside, and glance across the breakfast table. The ink still stains your fingers, as though the judgments of strangers have marked you personally. Marriage, you realize, is no longer only lived in parlors and bedrooms. It is lived in headlines, in caricatures, in sermons, in gossip columns. It belongs not to you and your husband, but to the endless appetite of a society that insists on watching, judging, laughing, and lecturing. The printed word has a way of lingering, even after the page is yellow and the ink fades. In Victorian England, it seeps into every household, shaping expectations so deeply that you begin to mistake them for your own thoughts. You find yourself asking whether your marriage measures up to the examples set in the papers, whether you have failed some invisible standard laid down in ink. It is not just neighbors who judge you now. It is the nation itself, peering over your shoulder at the breakfast table. By evening, your husband sits in his chair, the crinkle of the newspaper loud in the quiet room. He chuckles at a cartoon of a harried husband hiding from his wife while you stitch in silence. The joke lands differently for him than for you. For him, it is harmless humor. For you, it is a mirror of the double standards you live with daily. You lower your gaze to your work, careful not to let your expression betray the sting. But newspapers were not the only voices in print. Penny, dreadfuls and serialized novels poured into homes, their lurid tales of ruined maidens and cruel husbands blurring the line between fiction and warning. Some stories painted wives as tragic martyrs, others as cunning deceivers. Readers devoured, then by candlelight, half for entertainment, half for lessons in what to fear. The cheap paper smelled of ink and glue, the words imprinting themselves on minds already saturated with sermons and gossip. And then there were the reformist journals, bolder, angrier, sharper. They spoke of injustice in marriage law, of cruelty, unpunished, of women left destitute while men walked free. To read them was to feel a jolt of recognition, a sense that your own frustrations had been given words. But to admit you read them was dangerous. Neighbors might call you radical, hysterical, unfit. So you fold the pages carefully, slipping them behind cookbooks or beneath sewing baskets, your quiet rebellion tucked among the ordinary. A curious anecdote lingers in your mind. One paper once printed an entire column speculating whether women's corsets were responsible for marital discord, suggesting that tight lacing made wives irritable and unfit for domestic peace. The absurdity of it makes you laugh aloud, though softly, for laughter too easily draws questions. Imagine blaming whalebone and laces for the fractures in a marriage, as though inequality and silence could be stitched away with looser stays. Historians still dispute whether this flood of printed material liberated women by giving them new ideas or trapped them by reinforcing roles. Some argue the very act of reading, whether novels, advice, or reform tracts, gave wives a private world where they could imagine alternatives. Others counter that the sheer weight of judgment printed daily only deepened their prisons, suffocating them with ink instead of chains. The truth, perhaps, lies in the contradiction. The same paper that inspired also constrained, offering both hope and humiliation in its columns. As you extinguish the lamp and fold away your sewing, you cannot shake the sense that you live in two worlds. One is the home, where silence and duty reign. The other is the printed world, loud with debates, caricatures, warnings, and possibilities. And though the ink stains fade from your fingers by morning, the words remain in your mind, whispering long after the paper is gone. The clock ticks heavily on the mantelpiece, the air in the room still with the faint smell of coal smoke, and you realize that marriage in Victorian England has always been shadowed by the threat of law. Not law as an impartial protector, but law as an iron chain, forged in statutes and precedents that leave wives bound in ways no ring ever could. You know this with every fibre of your being. Once vows are spoken, your legal self is consumed by your husband's. The doctrine of coverture hovers like a spectre over your days, declaring that a wife and husband are not two but one, and that one is always him. You cannot sign contracts, cannot sue, cannot even truly claim your own wages or inheritance. Even your body, by law, is his domain. It is not partnership, it is absorption. And yet, cracks in this wall begin to show. Courtrooms fill with whispers of cases where wives have dared to resist. Divorce, once nearly impossible, becomes the subject of heated debate. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 finally dragging the matter out of the private chambers of church courts and into the glare of civil law. For the first time, couples may legally part without an act of parliament, but the hurdles are steep and the path more forgiving to husbands than wives. Adultery alone is enough for a husband to cast aside his wife. A wife, however, must prove adultery plus cruelty, desertion, or something equally grave. Justice itself seems tilted, as though the scales were weighted with lead on one side. In the pamphlets and debates, the tension crackles. Some insist that loosening divorce will unravel society, that families will crumble, that immorality will spread like smoke across the city. Others argue that without reform, countless women will remain trapped in households that are prisons in all but name. You feel the tug of both worlds as you listen to these debates retold at tea tables and across the pews at church, the arguments swirling like autumn leaves around your feet. And within this world of grim law, a curious detail arises, so bizarre, it feels almost absurd. In some cases, husbands literally sold their wives at markets, leading them with halters around their necks or wrists to be claimed by other men. These sales, though technically illegal, were reported in provincial papers well into the century, treated with a mix of scandal and satire. Imagine standing in a marketplace, the smell of livestock and mud around you, as a woman is paraded like cattle in front of a crowd. It shocks you, horrifies you, but it also reveals just how thin the line was between metaphorical ownership and literal sale. Historians still argue whether such sales were relics of an older age, fading into extinction, or a crude safety valve for trapped couples with no legal means of separation. Some suggest they were rare, sensational exceptions, amplified by newspapers hungry for shocking tales. Others argue they were more common than polite society admitted, part of the hidden landscape of working-class life where law offered no escape. Either way, the image lingers. Marriage exposed in its rawest form, stripped of lace and sermon, revealed as transaction. You sit by the fire, folding your hands tightly, and feel the weight of the law pressing down. It is not just your husband who binds you, not just your neighbors or your church. It is the very framework of society, its statutes and precedents, its judges and clerks. And though reforms whisper at the edges, offering faint hope, you know the truth. In Victorian England, marriage is not merely a vow. It is a contract written in ink you never held the pen to sign. The crack of carriage wheels outside reminds you that the law is never far away. It rattles through every street, waits in every ledger, breathes down the back of every wife who dares to question her place. Even after reforms, the courtroom is not a refuge, but another theatre of shame. For a woman to stand before a judge is to strip herself bare. Not only her grievances, but her character, her virtue, her very soul laid open for strangers to pick apart. You imagine yourself in such a courtroom, the wood panels smelling of polish, the judge's wig absurd yet terrifying, the gallery full of curious faces craning to hear your misery. To prove cruelty, you must speak of blows, of words hurled like stones, of nights when fear kept you awake. To prove adultery, you must recount humiliations in excruciating detail, while your husband denies and smirks. And even if you succeed, even if the court believes you, the newspapers will seize your story, printing it for breakfast tables across the country. You will never escape the ink. For most wives, the prospect is too terrible. They stay, they endure, they pray that silence is safer than justice, and so the law, meant to protect, instead traps. There are absurdities here too. Absurdities that almost make you laugh if the stakes were not so cruel. In some rural areas, rather than face the impossible hurdles of divorce, couples devise their own rituals of separation. A man might stand at a crossroads, proclaim his wife free, and hand her to another with witnesses looking on. Such spectacles, half comic and half tragic, reveal how deeply people longed for escape, even if the law denied it. Imagine the awkwardness of the scene. A woman standing stiffly while two men barter over her, onlookers pretending it is binding, though no statute ever said it was. It is theatre, yes, but theatre born of desperation. Historians argue about how far these reforms of the 1850s and beyond really shifted the ground beneath women's feet. Some claim the introduction of civil divorce cracked open possibilities, however narrow, allowing a few brave wives to walk away from unbearable marriages. Others argue that the system remained a trap because the shame, expense, and double standards were so steep that most never dared. The records show both truths. A handful of women who seized their freedom, many more who remained in silence. Back in your own parlor, the fire burns low. The law hovers like a presence you cannot banish, its power etched into every contract, every coin, every breath of your marriage. You know that if you falter, the law will not catch you, but cast you further down. And yet, somewhere in the distance, voices continue to press for reform, pamphlets continue to circulate, debates continue to rage. You smooth your skirt, sigh softly, and blow out the lamp. Tomorrow will come again, and with it the weight of vows, neighbors, sermons, and statutes. Marriage, in this world, is not just love or duty. It is a contract forged by law, enforced by shame, and carried on your shoulders, whether you consent or not. The lamps flicker low, their glow turning the wallpaper a dull gold, and you realize that after all the vows, the sermons, the laws, the scandals and the silences, Victorian marriage has been less a sanctuary and more a crucible. Every day has pressed you into a shape designed by others, neighbors, ministers, lawmakers, editors, until you can hardly tell where your own reflection begins and their expectations end. By now, you have walked through decades of duty. You have known the sting of silence at the breakfast table, the ache of pregnancies endured, the humiliation of double standards, the suffocating weight of appearances. And yet still, society insists this is the natural order. the divine pattern, the keystone of empire. The story of Victorian marriage is told as triumph, but you know it as endurance. You sit at your writing desk, pen hovering above the page, and try to imagine what legacy will remain. Perhaps your children will remember you as patient, devoted, respectable. Perhaps they will never know the quiet rebellions you hid. Pamphlets tucked beneath sewing baskets, dreams whispered only in prayer. The world may call your marriage respectable, but you know it was more survival than sanctity. There is one curious thing about the twilight of this era. Spiritualists and reformers begin to whisper of new possibilities. Seances are held in candlelit parlors, widows and wives alike, clasping hands around tables, hoping to reach voices beyond. Some sought comfort for grief, others sought messages of freedom. The very idea that unseen worlds might hold truths denied in this one seemed to breathe hope into stifled lungs. You imagine yourself in such a circle, the air thick with candle smoke, wondering whether the spirits might speak of a future where marriage is chosen, not endured. Historians continue to debate whether the Victorian marriage system was truly as oppressive as it appears in hindsight. Some argue that tenderness and companionship often grew, that within the cage, genuine love sometimes flourished like ivy across stone. Others maintain that for every story of affection, countless others endured cruelty, silence, and loss of self. The truth is both. Marriage is varied, but the structure of law and custom tilted against women all the same. The rain taps softly against the window, and you realize how heavy the performance has been. Respectability demanded not just silence, but a smile. Law demanded not just obedience, but surrender. The church demanded not just faith, but patience without end. And all the while, your own desires, your own self, were folded smaller and smaller until they fit inside the corset of respectability, laced tight until you could scarcely breathe. Yet as you lean back in your chair, you allow yourself one thought. Perhaps survival itself is a kind of victory. To have endured, to have held on to fragments of yourself, to have whispered dreams into the darkness, even when the world would not listen. Perhaps that is a triumph all its own. The candle burns, low, and the room sinks into that peculiar stillness where every creak of timber feels like a whisper. It is the end of the story, or perhaps the end of one chapter, and the quiet beginning of another. For all its weight, Victorian marriage has not broken you. It has scarred you, pressed you, silenced you. But still you are here, breathing in, the dusk, alive to the possibility that something softer waits beyond. You think of the generations to come, of daughters and granddaughters who may step into a world less bound by silence. Already, reformers' voices ripple outward. Already laws shift in Parliament. Already pamphlets carry dangerous ideas from hand to hand. The future will not be free of struggle, but perhaps it will not look so much like this. Women bent double, under duty, trapped by law, judged by neighbours. You hope they will know marriage as choice, not cage. A peculiar image stays with you, half comic, half profound. Widows in seaside towns who took to wearing lavender instead of black, daring to soften their mourning despite disapproval. Such small rebellions, fabric and colour, become acts of courage. You smile faintly at the thought, wondering if your own quiet endurance might also be rebellion, a refusal to vanish entirely into duty. Historians may argue forever whether Victorian marriage was prison or partnership, whether love flourished or suffocated, whether reform changed enough or only scratched the surface. You know the truth in your bones. It was all of it. It was tenderness and cruelty, laughter and silence, illusion and endurance. It was a world where women learned to live in cages, yet still found ways to sing. Now the lamp gutters, the shadows, stretch, and it is time to set down the burden. You close your eyes, breathing slowly, letting the noise of the city outside fade into something distant, like the ebb of the sea. The story has been long, the nights heavy, but the telling is done. So, As you lie here with the echoes of the past swirling gently through your mind, allow yourself to release them. Imagine the streets of Victorian London growing quieter, the gas lamps dimming one by one, the clip-clop of horses softening until it vanishes into silence. The soot settles, the curtains draw closed, the parlour empties. The performances, the trials, the endless duties, they fade, leaving only the gentle hush of night. Your breath slows. The walls around you, once heavy with duty and expectation, grow lighter. The sharpness of judgment dulls, the weight of law slips away, and in its place comes calm. You no longer have to perform, no longer have to carry the cage of respectability. Here, in this moment, there are no neighbours watching, no sermons pressing, no ink-stained headlines. Only you, safe and still, listening to the gentle hum of the world as it drifts into sleep. If you wish, picture a single candle burning on a bedside table, its flame small but steady. It does not demand anything of you. It simply glows, warm and quiet. You watch it flicker, its light softening the corners of the room until even the candle, too, fades into the velvet dark. Let the story go now. The worries of Victorian England belong to another time, another place. You are here, in this moment, free to rest. The weight of history has been told, the burdens carried, and now they are put down. Your body grows heavier against the bed, your breath longer, your eyelids softer. Sleep waits for you gently, like a friend arriving without hurry, without noise. It will take you by the hand, lead you away from the echoes of law and lace and duty, into a place of stillness where no judgment follows. Let yourself drift there now, step by step, breath by breath, until the world fades completely into calm.